Welcome to Session 1, Transportation and Health. I'm Alex Stockman, Program Coordinator for Missoula in Motion. Missoula in Motion is a program of the Office of Planning and Grants. Missoula in Motion strives to educate Missoulians on their transportation options through various outreach projects and events, including the Way to Go Club. Missoula in Motion promotes the many sustainable transportation options offered in Missoula County and community in an effort to reduce congestion, pollution, and stress while promoting both individual and community health. Today we're reducing our carbon footprint by allowing our speaker, Todd Alexander Littman, who got stuck in Victoria, to do his presentation via webcast. So please understand that we're using some innovative technology here, and hopefully the presentation will happen without a hitch. Todd is our speaker today. He's the Executive Director of the Victoria Transport Policy Institute, an independent research organization dedicated to developing innovative and practical solutions to transportation problems. His research is used worldwide in transportation planning and policy analysis. Mr. Littman has worked on numerous studies that evaluate transportation costs, benefits, and innovations. In this session, Mr. Littman will discuss his research on the various ways the transportation policies affect public health, ways to incorporate these into transport and land use planning. In particular, he will share his research on ways to increase active transport and how land use factors affect travel behavior, such as walking activity. It's with pleasure that I introduce Todd Littman.
And greetings from Victoria, British Columbia. I'm very sorry I can't be there. Alex might have mentioned that I actually have some personal connections there in Montana. Years ago, my wife and I took a bicycle tandem tour that led us through Missoula, and we had a great time staying at your local youth hostel. So let me proceed here. Unfortunately, we won't be able to have the degree of interaction that I generally like to have in my presentations. But I will do my best to make sure there's plenty of time for questions and comments. First of all, let me just check in. Is my voice coming through well? Okay. So I'm going to talk about the research, some of the new research on transportation and health, and how it can be used in transportation planning, and particularly with regard to multimodalism and mobility management or transportation demand management. So I want to show you a little trip that I take. This is leaving my front porch. This is walking down the street in front of my house and turning a corner and walking about 4 blocks to our local high school. If anybody's been to Victoria, you might be familiar with Victoria High School. And around the block to one of my favorite destinations, a little commercial center. And it's interesting to note, this is a classic little urban village commercial center that developed when Victoria had a streetcar system. So this was one of the streetcar stops. And we walk over to one of my favorite destinations, which is our local pub. So let me ask you this, if we can get a little interaction here. When I go to my local pub, is it good that I should be able to walk there? Yeah. Okay. Why is it better for me and for when I go to a pub, I walk rather than drive? Yeah, unfortunately, because of the poor connection here, I'm just going to guess about your answers. This is usually, you know, we would be able to do a lot more interactive. But let me point out just some things. First of all, this little urban village, it lacks a lot of parking. Let me go back one space. There's not a lot of big parking lots here. There's not a wide road. So I'm reducing, by walking rather than driving, I'm reducing traffic congestion and parking demands. And I'm helping my little village stay that kind of walkable center that makes it so nice. In addition, I'm reducing my carbon footprint, the amount of air pollution I'm emitting, my energy consumption, and my chance of having a traffic accident, of causing a car crash, both when I'm going to the pub and in particular when I'm returning from the pub. I'm also getting a little bit of exercise, which means that I can drink a little bit more without putting on weight. And there's an interesting little detail. Victoria does not have any oil wells. So $1 spent on filling up the tank of my car with gas provides no economic development benefit in Victoria, except the labor of the clerk who's selling me the gasoline. But Victoria does have several microbreweries. So when I fill up my tummy with beer so that I can fuel my walking, I'm also supporting local economic activity, particularly if I buy the local product. So this is just one example of the value to society overall of relying more on alternative modes and less on driving. And some of these impacts, some of these benefits have to do with health and safety. So let's proceed a little bit here. I want to put this into perspective. I've taken the 10 leading causes of death in the United States. Actually, I've adjusted this. I'm using something called potential years of life lost, which takes into account the age at which people die and therefore gives a higher rating to diseases that kill people when they're young rather than when they're old. And when you measure risk this way, motor vehicle crashes actually turn out to be about the third greatest cause of death. And heart diseases and strokes are very significant. And cancer, which is somewhat associated with exposure to pollution, is also very significant. And what this suggests is that transportation planning decisions can have a very significant impact on overall health, on the various risks that cause a lot of deaths in modern societies. Now, I want to mention a little bit about the differences that we see, the differences that we perceive these risks depending on how we measure the risk. And just as an example, this graph shows traffic fatality rates in the U.S. measured in two different ways. Now, traffic safety professionals like to measure risk per unit of travel, that is per 100 million vehicle miles or billion vehicle kilometers. And if you measure risk this way, it does look like traffic fatality rates have plummeted, have declined about 60% over the last 40 or 50 years due to things like people wearing seatbelts and safer roads and cars and things like that. But measured per population, that is per 10,000 population, traffic fatality rates have hardly declined at all. The difference is that as the rates decline per mile, people have driven far more miles. And so the rate has been pretty constant. Taking into account all the safety strategies and programs that have been implemented and the money that's been spent on safer cars and better emergency response, you actually would expect a far greater reduction in fatalities. So when rates are described per vehicle mile, we can say we've been very successful at increasing safety. But when rates are measured per capita, as with other medical or health risks, we've failed to achieve safety despite these huge efforts to improve traffic safety. And so I do want to emphasize that there are differences in perspective, and I think that the right way to measure risk is per capita, because that's the way people actually measure it. Here's a different perspective. You know, the United States has one of the lowest per mile traffic fatality rate, but one of the highest per capita among peer countries. This is another indication that you can either say we've been very successful, or you could say we're actually failing to achieve safety. And here's some research that I've done. As far as I know, I'm one of the first people that have put the U.S. traffic highway statistics together in this way. This graph is based on data from the U.S. Federal Highway Administration's Highway Statistics series. And I took several years of data for various states, and the data are divided into urban and rural areas of each state. And this shows the relationship between per capita traffic fatality rates and per capita annual vehicle mileage. And it shows an amazingly strong relationship, indicating that if you live in a community that's very high mileage, your chance of dying in a car crash is much, much higher than it would be in a less automobile-dependent community. This isn't surprising, and yet this has hardly been discussed in the conventional traffic safety literature. Usually, the emphasis of traffic safety has been on reducing risk per mile, not reducing mileage as a traffic safety strategy. This graph shows the fatality rates for different modes and divides the risk into the risk of the vehicle occupant or the user and the risk to others. And one of the things that this indicates is that as a vehicle, automobiles are relatively high risk, and public transit is pretty safe, and particularly it's safe to occupants. So one of the implications of this is that to the degree that we can shift people from automobile to public transit, total risk is declining because there's less risk to them, to the transit occupants, and that the total amount of automobile travel, and therefore the total amount of people exposed to the external risk, has also declined. This graph is simply a different way to show similar data. This shows the relationship between traffic fatalities and annual transit passenger miles, which can be considered an indication of the automobile dependency of a community. These are for U.S. cities. And what it shows is that if you live in a more transit-oriented community, that your chance of dying in a car crash tends to be much, much lower, say a quarter of what it is in the most automobile-dependent communities where people drive much less, or drive much more. And an interesting detail is the same finding occurs when you look at non-motorized travel, that as the percentage of non-motorized work trips increases, traffic fatality rates per capita tend to decline. And this is particularly interesting because some people are afraid to promote non-motorized transportation because they think that it's dangerous. They think that it's going to increase traffic fatality rates. But the truth is that it doesn't. What this suggests is that the reduction in crash risk to other people, even if walking and cycling has a relatively high crash rate per mile of travel, per mile of walking and a mile of bicycling, that's more than offset by the reduction in per capita travel, that people are simply traveling fewer annual miles when they shift to a more walkable community, and that any additional risk to users is more than offset by reduced risk to others. So promoting walking and cycling is not necessarily increasing traffic accident risk. And here's another graph showing pretty much the same thing when cities are divided, or counties, U.S. counties divided based on a sprawl index. So out of 250 or so U.S. counties, the 10 smartest growth counties have about a quarter of the per capita traffic fatality rate as the 10 dumbest growth counties. Again, I think that what's important here is that there's been a lot of discussion about the value of smart growth and the value of trying to implement strategies such as growth management strategies. And the discussion is almost always about direct consumer benefits and environmental benefits. The traffic safety benefits have been pretty much overlooked, even though my own analysis suggests that the traffic safety benefits are among the greatest benefits of smart growth, and strategies such as smart growth are some of the most cost-effective and effective ways to increase traffic safety. And yet this discussion has been pretty much overlooked. And I think it's a real opportunity for us to promote the benefits of a more accessible multimodal community and lifestyles. Now, I just want to check in. Let me take a pause here and see if there are any questions that have come up over what I just covered.
It doesn't look like it, Todd.
Okay, good. I'm just going to throw a little bit more data at you. This is the previous data that I showed, the previous graphs, were all looking at traffic fatality rates at a community level, at an aggregate level. This is actually some research I did a few years ago looking at individual vehicles. So we were able to get 750,000 vehicle years worth of data where we could match up individual cars, individual vehicles' insurance claim rates versus their annual mileage. And not surprisingly, it shows a pretty strong positive relationship. So, and there's an interesting little detail in that because most traffic, about 70% of traffic crashes involve multiple vehicles, there's actually an even greater safety benefit than people would think when we reduce vehicle mileage in a community. Described differently, even if you didn't reduce your mileage, you benefit if your neighbors reduce their mileage in terms of safety, because there are fewer vehicles on the road to be the victim or the target if you make an error in your driving. So reducing traffic density actually provides safety, and an interesting detail of that is that it suggests that every 10% reduction in vehicle travel in a community provides about a 12 to 15% reduction in traffic accident rates. So it's another indication of the very large potential safety benefits that come from reducing per capita vehicle travel. Now, I do want to mention that traffic safety is just one of several health impacts that are affected by transportation planning decisions. So the health benefits, the potential health benefits of improved or application of mobility management and multimodalism include traffic safety, pollution reduction, increased physical fitness, increased community cohesion. That means increased chance of you and your neighbors becoming friends, and some mental health benefits that are associated with that. Increased household affordability, which I think has some very significant health benefits, because you're reducing the stress on households and you're leaving them more money to spend on things like healthy food. And a more diverse transportation system helps provide basic mobility, including access to medical services. So to the degree that we can create a more accessible multimodal community, we're allowing people, particularly disadvantaged people, what you could call mobility disadvantaged people, greater access to medical services. And so I think all of these safety and health factors should be considered, and virtually all of them emphasize the benefits of having more multimodal, accessible communities. And let's compare these costs. I've done a lot of research looking at how to value various costs of transportation. And what's interesting is that there's current transportation planning tends to emphasize traffic congestion problems. So the implication is that traffic congestion is the worst transportation problem and should be the emphasis of our transportation planning. And yet, overall, traffic congestion is a pretty minor cost. Traffic accidents, crash damages are much, much bigger overall. And air pollution is about comparable to congestion. And what this says is that it would be foolish to reduce our traffic congestion problems in a way that exacerbate health problems. So for example, if there was a particular congestion reduction strategy that reduced congestion by, say, 20%, but it increased crashes by 5 or 10%, it would not be a cost-effective investment. But if an alternative strategy reduced traffic congestion by 20%, but it also reduced traffic accidents by only, say, 5%, then it becomes about twice as beneficial. So this is suggesting that the strategies that provide multiple benefits, the co-benefits, are very important, particularly with regard to health and safety. So we can think of it, especially if you're getting involved in any of the discussion about climate change emission reductions and energy conservation. One way to put it is a gallon of fuel saved by reduced driving provides an order of magnitude greater benefits than a gallon saved by increasing fuel efficiency or shifting to alternative fuels, because it does things like reduce traffic congestion, reduces accidents, and in a lot of cases it improves mobility for non-drivers. And if you ask people, particularly people who are at risk of not getting enough exercise, so people who lead sedentary lifestyles, what type of physical activity they will actually stick with over the course of their life. So if you're trying to get people to exercise not just in their 20s and 30s, but in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, there's pretty much only one strategy that works for the broad population, and that is to improve walking conditions and encourage people to walk. So to the degree that we're concerned about the health effects of sedentary living, improving walkability is very, very important. Here's the results of an interesting study. This is travel statistics from Portland, Oregon, looking at daily minutes of travel. Now this is interesting because usually most travel statistics are presented per distance, that is miles of travel. And when measured that way, walking and public transit actually look pretty tiny. They're not very significant. But the way people experience travel is based on time. That is the amount of time they experience different modes. And when measured this way, walking and cycling turn out to be much more important. And this graph shows that when people live in a more urban environment, that they tend to walk significantly more and are approaching the amount of time, the amount of daily moderate physical fitness that's required for people to be healthy. So this is suggesting that the land use patterns, by creating what we call an urban village, which is a walkable center in people's neighborhoods, that we can achieve a very significant portion of the physical fitness that's needed for health just through normal transportation activities. So the dashed line is the 20 minutes a day of basic physical fitness. So as I mentioned, if you measure travel activity based on distance, non-motorized travel looks pretty insignificant. Maybe 5% of, or 3 to 5% of trips in distance. But when measured based on time, it actually turns out to be 15 to 25% of travel. And therefore, I think that suggests that we can justify far greater emphasis on non-motorized travel. So most travel surveys, they only count non-motorized travel if a trip is totally by walking or cycling. So by conventional travel surveys, if you spend 10 minutes walking to a bus stop, 5 minutes waiting for a bus, 10 minutes on the bus, and 5 minutes walking to your destination, that traditionally was coded simply as a public transit trip. Similarly, if you drive to work and park a few blocks away and spend 10 minutes walking from your parking lot to your work site and running errands down around your work site during your lunch period, those walking components are traditionally overlooked. So if you do incorporate all those uncounted walking trips, it turns out that walking and cycling activity are 2 to 6 times more common than most travel surveys indicate. Now, another, what I consider to be a health factor that I think is important, often overlooked, is affordability. That is, the cost of transportation imposes a significant burden on particularly lower income households. And this graph indicates that people who live in a more multimodal community tend to spend far less of their household income on transportation than people who live in a more automobile-dependent community. And I think this is, it's a little, it's not always clear to other people why affordability is so important for health, but it certainly is important for households, and particularly working-class households. And I think that it's worth emphasizing this, that if we want to help people have more affordable lifestyles and better options. For example, if somebody is losing their job because of the current economic downturn, one of the things that we can emphasize is that they're going to be better off if they have a more multimodal transportation system. And as I mentioned, another what I consider to be a very important benefit, and you could consider it a health benefit or a community benefit, is what's called community cohesion, which is the quantity and quality of positive interactions among people in a community. And there is some research, there is quite a bit of research about this that suggests that the quality of walking environments in a neighborhood is very, very important in terms of community cohesion. And for equity, if we're interested in creating a more equitable transportation system, a more diverse transportation system, it helps achieve equity objectives. So that, up to now, I've been talking about why it's important to have a more multimodal, diverse transportation system. And let me talk briefly about the how. And I like to talk in terms of what I call win-win transportation solutions, which are market reforms that are justified on economic principles that help provide economic, social, and environmental benefits, that do things like improving travel options, providing incentives to use travel alternatives or alternative modes, that improve accessible land use accessibility, so create the kind of neighborhoods where people can walk to stores and children can walk to school, and incorporate these policy and market reforms. And so if you are transportation planners engaged in transportation demand management programs, this is what you do. And so what I'm emphasizing here is the kind of work you do is really the true solution to our transportation problems and the way to incorporate health objectives in them. So let's talk a little bit about what these strategies can look like. And here's the challenge that we face. We're an increasingly affluent society, and a lot of people quite rightfully take pride in being economically successful and being able to afford things like nice cars. And the question is, is it possible to convince somebody who's purchased a Mercedes-Benz or a BMW to leave that car at home and use public transportation for some of their trips? And I would argue that yes, it is, but we need to change our emphasis if we're going to attract discretionary travelers. We need to think much more about service quality so that we're creating the kind of quality transportation services that really appeal to people, to consumers who are accustomed to being pampered. So we need to rethink what constitutes a walkable neighborhood and a public transit service, and how to reach out to people so we're not presenting these services as something as a last resort, but we're actually presenting them as the premium service that should be attractive to people who have a lot of options to choose from. And it's quite feasible to do. We have seen plenty of examples of places where communities are able to offer high quality transportation options that are attractive to discretionary travelers. But part of it is working out some details that often get overlooked. For example, some of the research I've been doing recently looks at the value that people put on their travel time. That is the cost per minute of travel. And one of the things that really comes out is that the time people spend waiting for a bus or a train has a very high cost. If you have to wait out in the rain or out in the snow or out in the sun at the side of a busy road for a bus or a rideshare vehicle, that's a very expensive minute. It's not very nice. But if we can create attractive stops and stations and improve the walkability of the work site, so that once you arrive at your work site, say you carpool to work or you vanpool to work, once you get there, it's pleasant to walk to the local stores and walk to a little cafe down the street. Then it becomes much more feasible for people to use alternative modes. So I think what we have to really do is apply a marketing approach where we explore with potential consumers, potential users of our service, what kind of features are going to make that service attractive to them and provide those kind of improvements. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot that can be done and it needs to be done to create more walkable and cyclable improvements. There's a lot we can do to create the financial incentives so people find it financially attractive to use alternative modes. For example, right now, the incentive, when you pay for insurance, the incentive is to drive your car in order to get your money's worth. And it's actually, one of the strategies that I work with a lot is what we call distance-based pricing. So your insurance and vehicle registration fees are based on how much you drive, and this gives a significant additional financial incentive to reduce mileage and use alternative modes. One of the other very effective strategies is to get control over parking. Right now, most parking is unpriced. It's provided free. But there's really no free parking except in the game of Monopoly. Really, the choice is between paying for parking directly or indirectly. And charging users directly is always more equitable and more efficient, because it means that if you do shift to an alternative mode, if you do walk or bicycle or carpool or use public transportation, you're not forced to pay for parking spaces that you're not actually using. And there are a number of specific strategies that we can use to do this. Now, I know Missoula, Montana, or Montana in general, is not the place to talk too much about road pricing, but particularly in larger cities, there's a lot of interest in using more efficient pricing, road tolls and road user fees in ways that can encourage more efficient transportation, and again, give people more of a financial incentive to reduce their mileage and use alternative modes. One of the strategies that I think is worth discussing, particularly now, is raising fuel taxes. Now, I don't know what the situation is in Montana, but most U.S. states have failed to raise their fuel taxes significantly in the last decade. And there are a number of reasons to suggest that now is a good time to do it. One is the very low prices of fuel now, so people can't legitimately say that it's a burden on consumers. And there is the need for more roadway revenue, and it's a very effective way to encourage more efficient transportation and reduce air pollution and climate change emissions and U.S. dependence on imported fuel. This graph shows the relationship between fuel prices and fuel consumption, and not surprisingly, there's a pretty strong relationship. The dot at the upper left is the U.S. Very high fuel consumption and very low prices compared with other countries in the world. And then another important strategy is smart growth, creating more accessible multimodal communities. Now, one important point, looking at the photo on the left, which represents a typical urban village, a walkable urban village, is that it does not mean there's no automobile travel. It means that there's a mix of automobile travels and other modes, where the sprawled landscape on the right, the point is that it's totally automobile oriented, that there is no real alternative to driving. And so I think, to me, this is a positive message. We're not telling people we're going to take something away. We're not taking away their ability to drive, but we're making sure that communities are set up in a more balanced way. So smart growth includes a number of factors. One of the traps we get into is sometimes people imply that smart growth is just density, and there's a lot more to it, and I think we can create smart growth communities that really respond to people's needs. For example, one of the trends currently is that a lot of suburban communities now are beginning to realize that it's in their interest to become more multimodal and create urban villages, even in the places that started off as very automobile dependent. And one of the key components of this is to make sure that we develop this, what's called location-efficient development, which means ensuring that there's affordable housing and affordable development or mixed income housing options in those more accessible locations. So what we don't want to do is create a few urban villages that are really nice, but that because they're so limited, they're expensive and unaffordable to the people who really need those amenities of being able to walk to local stores. So you call that transportation efficient development. So the research I've done indicates that a well-planned mobility management program can often reduce affected vehicle travel by 10 to 30%, and actually even more if integrated with some of the land use reforms, and that this provides many benefits. So we can summarize the safety impacts, that strategies that reduce overall vehicle travel provide proportionally or larger reductions in crashes. Strategies like pay-as-you-drive vehicle insurance gives higher-risk drivers an extra incentive to reduce their mileage. So a low-risk driver might be paying 3 or 4 cents a mile, where a high-risk motorist would be paying, say, 15 to 20 or even 25 cents a mile. So the low-risk motorist might only reduce their mileage about 5%, but that high-risk motorist, because they have a much greater financial incentive, might reduce their mileage by 30 or 40%, and so there's a greater safety benefit than just the proportional. It also turns out that smart growth provides quite significant reductions in casualties, in people being injured and killed, although higher density can actually increase the crash rates. You get more fender benders but fewer deaths. So smart growth, it depends on how you measure the risk. Shifting from driving to public transit and ride sharing tends to provide medium to large safety benefits depending on the conditions. And shifting from driving to non-motorized modes may increase risk when measured per mile, but tends to reduce total crashes due to reduced total mileage and health benefits. So if we were, there are a number of specific examples. I'm going to skip this and maybe we can go back to it. But there is good research showing that these mobility management or transportation demand management strategies really do provide significant safety benefits. Here's the way I like to look at it. I've taken various planning objectives. So most people, they think in terms of problems, traffic problems, like traffic congestion and the cost of building roads and traffic accidents. I like to flip that around. Instead of calling them problems, I call them planning objectives. So if traffic congestion is a problem, then reducing traffic congestion is a planning objective. If accidents are considered a problem, then improving traffic safety is a planning objective. And here's the point I want to make. If we expand roadways, so we spend a lot of money, improving intersections and adding more lanes on some of the arterials or building new highway. In most cases, at best, we're achieving one of those planning objectives, reducing traffic congestion. Even that's optimistic because usually within a few years, you've got enough induced travel that even the congestion reduction benefit has disappeared. But even using optimistic assumptions, at best, spending all that money on roadway expansion achieves one objective. And if we're a bunch of good environmentalists and we're fighting to get people to drive more efficient and alternative fueled vehicles, well, we might provide some energy conservation and pollution emission reduction benefits, but it actually doesn't achieve much else. I mean, there's actually no benefit to being stuck in congestion behind a hybrid car or being run over by an electric car. The problems are the same. In fact, they can actually be worse because it turns out that if you get people to drive a more fuel-efficient vehicle, they actually tend to drive more annual miles. So if we were to be successful in providing incentives for everybody to purchase hybrid cars, and so instead of buying say an 18 mile per gallon truck, we convince somebody to buy a 35 mile per gallon Prius or 40 mile per gallon Prius, they're going to drive more miles, and that means there's going to be more traffic congestion and more parking demands and more accidents and more sprawl. But if we are successful in implementing mobility management strategies and smart growth, we're achieving virtually all of those planning objectives. And so what this says is that the more comprehensive our analysis, the better we look. So let me provide some conclusions here. Mobility management is generally promoted to reduce congestion or pollution. Safety benefits and health benefits are often overlooked, yet increased safety and health appear to be among the largest potential benefits, and mobility management programs appear to be among the most cost-effective way to increase safety and other health objectives. And conventional planning tends to overlook the full costs of decisions that increase vehicle mileage and undervalues the full benefits of mobility management strategies that reduce mileage. So that was a lot of different details covered in a short time. There's much more information about these subjects that you can access on our website. So here's a list of some of the publications on our website that you could go to for more information. And I think we've got about 15 minutes for discussion. So I think I'll just stop now and wait for responses.
Thank you for a great presentation. I do have one question that seems to get brought up at different meetings. A lot of times we hear from other people that, well, we pay the taxes because we're the drivers and we pay the taxes, and you transit users and bicyclists don't pay enough. And one of the things that I've always, I always bring up, the accidents are expensive, but I'm wondering if you have a public cost per accident. So what does it cost us as public taxpayers to respond to every automobile accident? Is that out there somewhere?
It is, sort of. Now, looking at that list of publications, the second to the last item is a report that I wrote and, in fact, just updated called Transportation Cost and Benefit Analysis. And that includes...
Sorry, could you start again, please?
Okay. On that list of publications that I'm showing right now, the second to the last item is called Transportation Cost and Benefit Analysis. And that's a report that I've written and just updated it this last month that looks at the literature on the costs of different forms of transportation and various costs of transportation. And there's a chapter on accident costs or on safety benefits. And so you can go to that chapter and get the estimates that people have calculated of the costs of traffic accidents or the cost of traffic risk to society, and it does include those costs. Now, it's actually it's complicated because, in fact, only a small portion of the traffic crash costs are uncompensated costs borne by governments. Most of the costs are uncompensated costs borne by individuals. So, for example, if you're let's say your mother or your child is injured or killed in a car crash, well, you could never be compensated for the full cost of that. It can't be compensated monetarily, and there are certain ways that we do assign values to these, and it's those what's called non-market uncompensated costs that actually turn out to be very significant. But getting back to the question of public transit funding versus highway funding, one of the things to point out is that more than a third of the cost of roads is not borne by user fees, and that portion is increasing every year as governments fail to raise taxes to account for inflation. And so even using a fairly narrow definition of costs, it's actually quite clear that motorists are not paying their fair share. And even though the subsidy per passenger mile is much greater for a typical transit trip than for a typical automobile trip, motorists drive far, far more annual miles than transit riders ride on the bus or train. And so on a per capita basis, it turns out that transit riders are subsidizing motorists overall. And there is discussion of some of these points on in our website. There's a paper called Evaluating Rail Transit Criticism and some other publications related to this discussion of transit subsidies.
Thanks for the presentation. It struck me as a little bit out of character for Missoula when we saw the slide with it was a BMW or the Lexus. Needless to say, that's not really one of our demographics here. What I'm thinking is, how would you suggest to appeal to a cohort that's in crew cab four-wheel drive pickup trucks that cost about $40,000, and how do you get them to shift modes?
Right. Well, first of all, I think it's very useful for us to understand the basic principles of marketing, because that's really what we do. And a lot of people misunderstand marketing. They think marketing is advertising, but advertising is just the last step in the marketing process. The first step is understanding your market, your potential customers, and developing products that respond to them. So I think your point is very well taken, that you can't simply take the strategies that work in Los Angeles or Chicago or wherever and assume that they're going to work in Missoula. You have to talk with people and find out what's important to them. What are the problems that they face? and what are the types of solutions that would work for them. So let me just give you an example. It may be that, say, 50% of the commuters going to Missoula would never even, they're simply unreachable at this point. Now, at some time in the future, say when the price of fuel increases or they become more concerned about their own health, they might change. But let's just say that we'll accept that 50% of the population wouldn't even consider leaving their car at home, even one day a week. But if you can identify the subset of people who might respond, then you start asking, well, what is it that this product has to look like? I was involved in a van pool marketing study a while ago. We had a phone bank where people, we used a standard survey methodology, called up people who lived in the areas that are, say, 20 to 50 miles away from the urban centers in Puget Sound. And we asked them if they're interested in, well, first of all, we asked them if they commute, and if so, where do they commute to? And if so, how do they commute? So we narrowed it down to those people who really could van pool to a destination, to their work site, which really is an appropriate work site for a van pooling. So of those people for whom van pooling made sense, we asked, are you interested in finding an alternative to driving? And it turned out about a third of the people said, yes, I am interested. So then we explored with them what the van pool service would have to look like. And it turns out that a lot of people, for example, would be happy to van pool 1 or 2 days a week, but they can't van pool 5 days a week. And yet the current van pool model assumes that either you're totally in or totally out, that you're van pooling, you're subscribing for every day full time. And so one of the things we realized is we need a more flexible van pool model. And we needed to think we needed to get the employers involved, so the employers are helping to organize the van pools, and we needed some financial incentive that particularly to get people to try it that first month or two, so people who aren't currently van pooling will experience what it's like to not have the stress of driving and what the financial savings. And then things like pay-as-you-drive insurance and parking cash out would really make a huge difference in increasing the potential market for something like van pooling. So this is just to give you an idea of how I think we need to approach this. I'm not suggesting that that's the solution in Missoula, but what I would suggest is that in the future there are a number of trends that are increasing the value of alternative modes. Things like aging population, the fuel prices that right now they seem awfully low, but in the next decade or so we're going to start climbing again. Increased health concerns, increased traffic congestion and the associated stress of that. So if you can find the hooks, I think that you can convince a lot of people who are currently driving to leave their cars at home and use alternative modes for some of their trips, and that they will choose that, they will prefer that, they will be happier overall when given those options.
Todd, it looks like there are 2 more questions. And if you would pause a little bit longer so I can get the microphone back in place.
Sure.
Thanks, Todd. That was excellent. A question I have is, going back to planning, and Missoula just went through a long-range transportation plan update, and just like I think every long-range plan in cities of 50,000 or more in this country, the overriding criteria or objective, well, while the objectives say safety and energy efficiency and all the things you mentioned, I find that it's the congestion that is the overriding goal. That's what gets measured in the form of level of service and amount of delay. And then second, what will that do to the air quality? And third, can we afford it? Is it fiscally constrained? How can we make that shift that you're talking about, where we value safety and everything else that makes up, say, a livable community? It seems to be hard to make that type of shift locally when it's really federal highways or US DOT that has these criteria that then trickles to the local level?
Right, yeah, that's the challenge that we face. Well, first of all, I think one of the starting points is something you alluded to, which is develop multimodal level of service performance indicators. So the challenge that we face is the highway industry, or the highway engineers have developed these roadway level of service standards, which are just like an elementary school grade from A to F, and nobody wants to be an F, and everybody wants to be an A. It's visceral. And so it's easy for a highway planner to put up a map that shows the roadway links and the intersections that are currently or projected to be level of service D or worse, and that creates an imperative. It implies we have to fix these. Even though what we can demonstrate is, even if you were to expand those highway, those links and those intersections, within 5 years or even 2 years, you'd have almost no congestion reduction. That induced travel will fill up almost all of that. But even so, I think the key is to develop similar indicators. Now, our online TDM encyclopedia has a new chapter on multimodal level of service indicators, and it does describe some of the recent research on this that's developed these kind of indicators. And so you can put up a map that not only shows the roads where automobile travel has a low level of service, but you can say, here are all the areas where the walking conditions and the cycling conditions and the public transit service has a very bad level of service rating. And so you're on par. So you can start embarrassing people for living in a community where the walkability is LOS D or E. And you can start pointing out that widening this highway, well, that'll improve the highway level of service rating from a D to a C, but by widening the highway and increasing traffic speeds, it's going to reduce walkability LOS from let's say D to E. And so you can start a discussion about the trade-offs between these different things. Now, in terms of the funding, I think that there is a real challenge because most states have, these very, dedicated, have funds that are pretty much dedicated to highways. But I think especially at the local level, we can start demonstrating that $1 spent to improve walking conditions and improve cycling conditions and in some cases improve transit service provides far more benefits overall, taking into account all these planning objectives, than $1 spent on continual highway expansion.
We have time for just one more question.
I enjoyed your talk. You've been very effective in advocating multimodal travel, and you've provided us a good deal of evidence for everyone to concur with your conclusions. The question I have pertains, it's actually a definitional one. You demonstrated or showed some evidence that non-motorized modes are much more common in areas that you refer to as areas with a high urban index, vice versa for those with a low urban index. It almost appears to be a bit counterintuitive. So can you explain to us what goes into that high urban index measurement and how you do that?
Well, yeah, and it actually may be inappropriate to even use the word urban in a western state like Montana because Westerners take pride in not being in being against cities, against urban. They're very distrustful. So let's use what I consider to be the positive vision is let's talk about walkable villages, walkable neighborhoods, and walkability is more than just having a sidewalk. It also means, for one thing, that there's not an excessive automobile travel volumes and speeds, so it's relatively safe and easy to cross a street, so you don't have those super wide arterials. And equally important is that you have the common destinations within walking distance of most houses. So a good indicator is simply what portion of children are able to walk to school. Think of the value. Think of all these different benefits that we just talked about: safety, health, community cohesion, reduced air pollution, physical fitness. Think of the difference between a neighborhood where it's safe and convenient for children to walk to school, and so you've got nice sidewalks, and you've got pedestrian shortcuts, and you've got traffic calming to reduce traffic speeds, and you've got schools right there in the neighborhoods within, let's say, a half mile of most houses. Well, that's a walkable neighborhood. And I don't care whether you call, maybe we don't need to use the word urban, although actually that's what we're talking about is more or less urban. But talk about a walkable village. And that is what I think we want to achieve, and I think it resonates pretty well, especially if you start talking about health. So if you could get your local doctors and medical professionals on board, and I should mention I'm currently involved in some work for the Center for Disease Control. So the medical community is beginning to understand this thing, that this is one of the most effective ways to increase public health and safety. If you can get the medical community to start talking about the value of living in a walkable, accessible, multimodal neighborhood, then regardless of what you call it, the components will start falling into place. Now, does that come close to answering your question?
Yes.
Great.
All right.
Thank you all very much.